From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And ahead for you today, K-State's Gabe Sampson reports on his new analysis of the peer effects on irrigation adoption. In other words, how a neighbor's commitment to crop irrigation would potentially influence a producer's decision to adopt irrigation practices as well. Also, K-State's Art Barnaby will talk about the agenda for the 4-state series of crop insurance workshops that K-State will be co-sponsoring soon. Very useful information to be served up at these workshops. And on this week's horticulture segment, Extension's Gregg Eyestone will go over the steps for successfully composting organic material from the garden and home landscape starting this fall. All that and more here on Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State research and extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
Thanks for tuning in. You're listening to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. On this first segment, we want to pass along to you what is amounting to a novel look at irrigation adoption here in the state of Kansas and the peer effects on that practice adoption. Joining us now, an agricultural economist from K-State who teamed up with a peer in his department to take a look at the peer impacts on irrigation practices. His name is Gabe Sampson, our first time to visit with him. So, Gabe, welcome, first of all.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So this work that you've undertaken here, you say, is intended to lend to our understanding and knowledge of those things that affect producer decisions on committing to crop production via irrigation, specifically here drawing from our groundwater resources in the state. So as you went about this, what is meant by peer effects in the context of this analysis?
Yeah. So what led to the analysis was I'm a pretty visual person, and so when I got to K-State as an assistant professor 2 years ago, I started digging into this irrigation data that's available publicly. It's called the YMS data set. It's maintained by the Kansas Geological Survey. And just looking at spatial patterns of water rights adoption and how those patterns had changed over time, and what I saw was a pretty pronounced spatial clustering in these water rights through time, and those patterns seem to suggest that maybe there was a peer element in these patterns. And what we mean by peers is simply agricultural producers' closest neighbors. And so what we use as our definition is the 13 nearest neighbors of an agricultural producer, and we also use a definition of the 25 nearest neighbors of an agricultural producer.
So, in effect, you wanted to quantify through this analysis how neighbor adoption of irrigation practices would influence somebody else down the road who may be watching what they're doing?
That's right. And if you're learning from your neighbors and your neighbor takes a certain technological adoption, then does that affect the likelihood that you will do the same thing? Mm-hmm. And our evidence suggests that these types of behavioral responses do exist.
But to identify that and pin it down, you had to wade through considerable data. You mentioned that data set, which was valuable to that extent, right?
Yeah, so this is a really, really cool data set. And Kansas is great for a researcher because we have access to all this data that's publicly available. And so we have data on approximately 20,000 water rights to groundwater, 20,000 agricultural groundwater rights. This data extends back to 1943, so we have data on about 20,000 groundwater rights from 1943 to about present day.
So basically going back to the origins of what amounts to modern-day irrigation practices.
That's correct. You know, the idea is we wanted to look at the full adoption of groundwater going back as far as we could, and so we're looking at the the World War II area and when groundwater irrigation in Kansas just started to take off.
So then, attaching some numbers to that peer effect, what did you find in as far as the influence of neighbors on an individual's decision to go with irrigation?
Yeah, so we find that within that 13 nearest neighbor definition, so if one more neighbor in your 13 nearest neighbors adopts groundwater, then we find that you are more likely to adopt groundwater by about 0.25 percentage points, which is a pretty small number just in a marginal sense. But if you add that up across all 20,000 water rights and across the 65 or 70 years in our data, it turns out to speed up the adoption of groundwater quite a bit, and we attribute peer effects to about 11 million acre-feet worth of groundwater withdrawals across the history of the data.
In the High Plains Aquifer region primarily then?
Strictly restricted to the High Plains Aquifer region of Kansas. Okay. Yeah, so no surface water and no alluvial aquifer. We omitted that from the data.
Now, you say you really didn't quantify here how long it takes for a neighbor to make the move into groundwater irrigation after they've seen what their neighbors have been up to.
No, we aren't able to explore that relationship in detail. We were mostly interested in, the cumulative number of groundwater users within your 13 nearest neighbor, and then we use a 1-year lag for our measure, and that's based off the permitting process and the legal process in obtaining a groundwater right.
But to put it in a framework here, you said 11 million acre-feet of extraction from that additional adoption. That amounts to several years of usage of water from the High Plains Aquifer.
Yeah, so normal withdrawals from the aquifer currently are about 3 to 3.5 million acre-feet per year. And so we found a cumulative effect of about 11 million acre-feet, and so that translates into about 3 years of typical extraction from the aquifer.
So it's a significant volume.
Yes, we think this is significant, and one of the big policy implications is that these peer effects, these learning from your neighbors, can speed up the adoption process. And if you are a policymaker and you're trying to predict how fast technology is going to be adopted, and you do not account for these peer learning, then you're going to underestimate the adoption, the speed of adoption and the extent of adoption.
And now you're getting into how you hope this information that you've generated from this effort will be utilized in policy looking forward to our water use in the future.
Yeah, that's right. I think we can say something about well limitations and minimum well spacing from our peer effect. And then also, if you want to encourage the adoption of a certain type of technology, for instance, if you want to encourage adoption of a water-saving irrigation technology like low-energy precise application that you might put on a center pivot, then you might want to try to account for the social learnings, which might affect the extent and the speed of adoption. And so if you want to design a subsidy program, for instance, the subsidy, the effectiveness of that subsidy is going to be determined partly by whether or not there is a learning mechanism in peer-to-peer interactions.
So when you think of such technologies, and this is one that K-State agricultural engineers are deeply involved with now, mobile drip irrigation systems, these are the kind of principles that could well apply to understanding how producers may adopt that technology and how rapidly.
Yeah, that's right. And suppose you wanted to encourage adoption of those types of technologies, you might want to design an incentive program and target in certain areas where there's a high density of growers, for instance, and then you might expect sort of a spatial growth outward and technology adoption from there if there is, in fact, social learning that's happening.
Gabe, could this even be taken over into the area of organizational irrigation structures, and that is the local enhanced management areas in Kansas, and maybe fodder for discussion on establishing those?
Yeah, we don't make connections to local enhanced management areas in the paper, but I do think our results might have something to say about that, in that, these local enhanced management areas operate through like a collective action and cooperation. And if, we do find evidence that there is peer-to-peer influence in the history of groundwater adoption, and so insofar as that peer-to-peer influence seems to exist, that suggests that there is a certain amount of cooperation. I think that's as far as we could go with that discussion.
Nonetheless, this can lend to the dialogue on future irrigation adoption practices, policy, and you've a paper on this now that's been peer-reviewed and accepted in journals, so it's out there for the taking, if you will. Right?
Yeah, written with a peer, reviewed by peers, and it's all about peers and producer behavior. Yes, so the paper has been accepted now in the American Journal of Agricultural Economics and co-authored with my colleague Ed Perry, also in the Department of Agricultural Economics here. Just a really cool paper making use of really cool data. And it's not often, as an economist, that you can use data going back to the World War II era that covers 70-odd years. But, we're lucky to have this at our disposal, and we just think it's a really nice paper, and one of the first papers that we're aware of that can tie these peer influences to the history of total extraction of groundwater.
It really makes this unique, and if we've a policymaker out there, a producer out there who would like to know more about what you've uncovered here, this is accessible.
It's not yet online, but it will be forthcoming at the American Journal of Agricultural Economics, and I'm not 100% certain when it will be available, but we're hoping within the next month or two.
All right. Once again, it gets into, in detail, the peer effects on the adoption of irrigation practices and studying this phenomenon going all the way back to 1943 using this unique data set. Be watching for more word on this on the agmanager.info website, and we appreciate you coming over, Gabe, giving us an outline of what you've identified that could be of great importance in agricultural policy and irrigation adoption in Kansas going forward. Thank you for coming over.
Oh, well, thank you for having me.
Agricultural economist Gabe Sampson of K-State, who with his colleague Ed Perry from the Department of Agricultural Economics authored this work, lending to our further discussions about our irrigation practices in Kansas. You're listening to the K-State Radio Network. We'll return with more after this break here on Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
We're back now on this Agriculture Today. Kansas State University once more this year will be teaming up with land-grant universities in surrounding states to put on what annually is a fine series providing information to anybody with an interest in crop insurance. The 2018 crop insurance workshops have been all lined out at 4 locations, 1 in each of the cooperating states, and instrumental in these, of course, our guest, risk management specialist Art Barnaby of K-State Research and Extension. Art, it's actually going to be your victory lap, if you will, as part of these, right?
Yeah, they're putting me out the pasture. This is my last go, or my last rodeo, as they say. I think we've been doing these for nearly 20 years, if not 20 years. We were trying to figure that out, and I'm not exactly sure when we started. When we started it, Eric, we didn't think we'd do it but 1 year, and that's because we had grant money. Now we've continued to do it. The reason we've been able to do that, of course, is this does carry a registration fee with it, and that's why we could carry it on. We can fund it. Their plan now is to, with some changes, of course, they're going to try to carry this on into the future, and we're hoping we still get a good turnout this year and that it carries over into future years, because it doesn't seem like these issues ever go away. It's just a different set of issues every year, but
in fact, they accelerate every year.
Yeah, it seems that way.
Have over the several years these have been put on.
There's a lot of people that want to make changes to crop insurance, and I think it's not only important for crop agents, which is our primary audience, but secondary audience is farmers themselves and lenders. Understand some of those policy things so that they can better defend the program themselves. And what I'm getting at is it's pretty easy for people to say it out there and say the only reason farmers and bankers like crop insurance is because the government gives you a whole lot of money. That is absolutely not true. You only get paid if you have a loss. And if you understand the contract completely, and apparently most of the academic world doesn't, you can't get paid a check unless you actually do suffer a yield loss. It just is no other way. Otherwise, if you didn't need that, we could buy puts and get the same thing. It's just not true.
Yeah. The workshops, there is a theme associated with each of these. By the way, they are set for the latter part of October into the very early part of November. We'll give you the exact dates and locations in just a second. But the theme that canvasses the entire series of workshops, Successfully Navigating Washington, D.C. Waters, Government Programs to Commodity Markets. And underneath that umbrella, you've several pertinent topics on the program, right?
Yeah, starting off, we do have a Washington update. Christine Seifert, she's Director of Crop Insurance from Zurich, which is obviously a large international insurance company. We would have loved to have had her for all 4 meetings. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to fit that into her schedule. So when they come to Kansas and Oklahoma, it will be a staffer that will leading this discussion. So if you would like to listen to Christy in particular, I guess you'll have to come to Colorado or Nebraska.
So that will open each of these workshops, the Washington update. Then into the Farm Bill, and a subtitle here, Risk or Risk Management, and you have several individuals at the various locations taking that on.
Well, this will be more into the nuts and bolts of the policy itself, and in particular, they're going to start using RMA data in place of NASA data to determine the county yields for the ARC program. This is kind of a major change because you'd think county yield would be the same everywhere, but it's not. There are different agencies come up with a different set of numbers, and I don't want to debate on who's right or wrong. Doesn't really matter, but we're going to make this switch. Unfortunately, what that does for us, we were building a pretty good history based on what they were doing. In fact, we'd have been able to go back 10 years, and that county yield is the one that's critical to determine whether or not you've got a likelihood of getting payments.
By the way, conducting those particular sessions, Nebraska, Brad Lubin, in Colorado and Nebraska sessions, Kansas, Michael Taylor of K-State, and at Oklahoma's session, Amy Hagerman of Oklahoma State University.
I might say a couple of things about 2 of those presenters. Brad Lubin used to be here in Kansas, so most of you will know him, has really become very active in this area. Amy was hired away from the Farm Service Agency. Brings some real-world experience with her. And everybody in this state knows Michael. She does a great job.
Absolutely. So they will lend greatly to that topic. And then later on that morning, whole farm revenue protection, how it really works. And you've experts from the Risk Management Agency in to bring that to light.
Yeah, I've been looking at the data off of the RMA website and putting together some maps on participation as part of my presentation. One of the things you find is that at this point, there's very little participation in this whole farm. I think a couple of reasons, probably because it's pretty complicated to understand. It's based off your tax returns. But the one group out there that I think would be able to use this would be livestock producers. Now, would it provide you with the protection you're expecting? I mean, that's why I would show up at this meeting. That would be the kind of question I'd want answered. Is this provide me the kind of protection that's going to provide me coverage in the years when the livestock prices are low and maybe I had some unusual death loss? That's the kind of thing you would want covered. Or if you're selling hay, hay moves up and down too in terms of not only price but also yield. That's going to show up in this whole farm matrix. If you are in a commodity that doesn't really have a good insurance program, and what I'm thinking about is forages and livestock, that would be one that I definitely would want to learn more about.
And that's why a whole session devoted to whole farm revenue protection. There'll be the lunch on site. The afternoon part of the program will get into the respective grain and livestock market outlooks. Then there will be a brief presentation on federal monetary policy.
Well, Norm Dahlstead, who's my counterpart at Colorado State, is going to cover that. What we're dealing with here is we're seeing interest rates increase. We're seeing pressure on land prices. I don't think we've really seen land prices decline yet, but I don't know how much longer some of this can last. And if we start upping interest rates, it could create even more problems. Norm has worked with the Federal Reserve banks to prepare this presentation. We tried to get someone from the Federal Reserve banks, but they're in lockdown that week before they announce what they're going to do with interest rates, and therefore they're not allowed to go out and make these kind of presentations while they're in that mode. But he has a former student that works at the Federal Reserve Bank, and so helped him put this together, and so I'm sure he knows as much about it as anyone.
Then you will close out each of the workshops yourself, Art, and you've picked the topic, which policy should I buy, which opens the door fairly widely there, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, it does as far as I'm concerned, because if you think I'm going to tell you whether you should buy 75% YP or 50% CAT, no, that is a decision that every person who runs a farm, it's called management. You have to make those management decisions. It's my last presentation, and so I probably will take a little leeway with that. I've been looking at participation by various contracts, coverage levels, etc. I'm going to spend a little time talking about how far we've come. I mean, when I started 39 years ago, nobody wanted to talk about crop insurance. I mean, in fact, we probably wouldn't even send anybody to their meeting at the USDA if they hadn't called the director of extension and said, you shall send somebody. And being the youngest, newest member of the faculty, I got the job. My point is there's been a lot of improvements made to this contract. We've still got issues. We're running out of water, limited irrigation. Crop insurance is not very well set up for limited irrigation. So we've got some things that still could be worked on, and then a little bit on the future of this whole ag policy area.
Well, producers, if nothing else, if you want to hear Art's thoughts unfiltered on the state of crop insurance, then, now, and in the future, his session will round out these workshops. They are set for these dates, these locations: October the 30th at the Events Center in Brush, Colorado; October the 31st, Grand Island, Nebraska at the Heartland Events Center; November the 1st here in Kansas, in Salina at the Events Center there; and November the 2nd in Enid, Oklahoma, lastly at the Autry Technology Center in Enid. And Art, there's a fee involved, and you can get a break on that fee if you register by a certain date, correct?
Yes, $100 if you come in early, and you're well within the window, so you can register at any time for the $100 fee. Mm-hmm. If you want to come late and pay the higher charge, it's $120. Registration can be done online. You will find all of this, of course, on Ag Manager, prominently listed. You're always welcome to call me. Can't find me? Again, look on Ag Manager, and you will find my phone number and address, etc., and be glad to answer questions or respond to how do I get registered.
Excellent. Once more, agmanager.info out of K-State Agricultural Economics has the complete rundown on the program. Art, good luck with this series once again, and many thanks to you. Along with this, Art Barnaby, Risk Management Specialist, K-State Research and Extension, the 2018 Crop Insurance Workshops, October 30, Brush, Colorado; October 31, Grand Island, Nebraska; November 1, Salina, Kansas; and November the 2nd, Enid, Oklahoma. These sponsored by the respective land-grant universities in those states: K-State, Oklahoma State, Colorado State, and the University of Nebraska. You're listening to Agriculture Today. We'll return shortly on this, the K-State Radio Network.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128-plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today. Over this, the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson with you. Now, today's agricultural news headlines. These courtesy in part of DTN. The U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement may end up making the farmer aid plan drawn up by the administration smaller than originally estimated. That according to USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue in an interview with Reuters. As the agency takes into account the agreement, that could affect the total, he noted, added that the talks with Mexico and Canada on removing the steel and aluminum import duties and presumably their retaliatory actions against U.S. products, including agricultural goods, were just getting started. Further, Perdue also indicated he expected the rule to allow year-round sales of E15 would be ready before the 2019 driving season begins. Quoting Perdue, year-round sale of E15 will increase demand for corn, which is obviously good for growers. A California judge yesterday issued a tentative ruling for a new trial on the $250 million in punitive damages awarded to a groundskeeper who sought to hold the Roundup maker liable for his non-Hodgkin lymphoma. If finalized, Judge Suzanne Ramos-Polaro's ruling would grant a motion by Bayer arguing that sum wasn't justified and that the evidence didn't prove that the company intended to harm the plaintiff. It's not clear when the judge might finalize that ruling, which was issued ahead of a court hearing yesterday. The ruling calls into question the bulk of the $289 million judgment, the first in thousands of cases against alleged that the glyphosate, the main ingredient in Roundup, causes cancer. The jury verdict rocked Bayer weeks after the German company completed its takeover of Monsanto, which of course developed Roundup and Roundup-ready crop genetics. Bayer's stock has fallen about 20% since that verdict, as investors priced in the potential for hundreds of millions of dollars more in court judgments ahead. The plaintiff, Dwayne Johnson, is likely to appeal the ruling if it is finalized. Closer to home, an audit of state agency responses to two recent wildfires in Kansas showed that the state's wildfire suppression training and mitigation programs do not sufficiently prepare the state for wildfire response. That, according to Kansas State Forester Larry Biles and the fire management officer with the Kansas Forest Service, Mark Neely. They spoke before the state's Legislative Budget Committee recently in Topeka. Biles and Neely provided a review of the opinion from the Kansas Forest Service and the KFS Advisory Council on the legislative post-audit on wildfire suppression in the state. That LPA was conducted in response to the Anderson Creek and Starbuck wildfires, the two largest fires in the last 50 years, which caused significant damage in several counties in south central and southwest Kansas. Neely said that they believe the audit describes the inadequacies of a wildfire suppression system at the state level. One recommendation of this was to amend state law to designate a single entity to lead the wildfire suppression system. The LPA stated the state should ensure the entity has sufficient firefighting equipment, certified firefighters, and wildfire management personnel, and state funding to effectively and independently lead the state's wildfire suppression system. Now, in response to the LPA, Biles said that the Kansas Forest Service already provides assistance and high-quality training to firefighters, emergency managers, and local authorities. He says in his address to the Legislative Budget Committee, the KFS should be designated as the lead agency of wildfire suppression in the state. And Brazil's farmers could produce another record harvest of soybeans in the 2018-19 growing season as demand remains strong enough to spur growers to increase the area planted with beans. That, according to a new report from Brazilian crop agency CONAB, the country will grow from 117 to 119 million metric tons of soybeans in the current growing season, in which planting has already begun, according to CONAB. In the 17-18 season, Brazil's farmers produced a record 119 million tons of beans. Even with expectations of a large crop in North America, prices are still at levels considered profitable by producers, according to CONAB in its monthly grains bulletin. Brazil, the world's second largest soybean producer, following the United States. And that takes us right into this week's edition of the Kansas Soybean Update. Here's Gregg Eyestone.
Kevin Ripke, Regional Director for the Americas with the U.S. Soybean Export Council, joins us. And Kevin, the recent announcement that the U.S. and Canada coming to an agreement to be a part of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement is welcome news to soybean growers.
We're really excited about this agreement. As to steal some words from Secretary Sonny Perdue, it's a great day for trade. It seems to be like it has a lot of evolutionary aspects, but we definitely are in a much better position than we were previously under the old NAFTA agreement. We're looking forward to putting this kind of uncertainty behind us and getting on with the business of promoting U.S. soybeans and U.S. agriculture in general. It's hard when you conduct these meetings with these importers, and the first 30 minutes of the meeting is always consumed with uncertainty about NAFTA and the trading relationship and agreements. And after you get done discussing possible outcomes, all the air has been sucked out of the room, and it's difficult to move any agenda forward with these guys. So now that we've got this in the rearview mirror, we've got a good agreement, everybody's on board. Hopefully we can get it ratified really quickly and move on with the business of really selling U.S. soy, which is what we're here to do.
It's amazing to see the growth and the want of U.S. soybeans, especially with our neighbors, not only in Canada, but in Mexico, too.
But, I do want to urge a sense of caution. Last week, we had 700,000 tons of U.S. soybean sales to Mexico, and that's not going to continue. If you look at the numbers, Mexico's already bought 60% of its soybean need in the first 5 weeks of the U.S. marketing year, which implies that it's only going to need to buy another 1.5 million, 2 million tons of U.S. soybeans over the course of the next 11 months. So it's great to see the growth, but we also have to make sure that we're putting into perspective that the USEC and other organizations are saying U.S. soybeans and U.S. agriculture is certainly on sale right now, but we have to make sure that we're opening up other markets and seizing other opportunities elsewhere.
And there are opportunities out there to be able to do that?
We're out there looking definitely hard at other markets and certainly looking at markets where we don't have a good market share in. Under one of the new programs, the ATP program, which is part of the trade aid package, we're looking at about $200 million funding for MAP participants in order to really get after new markets and try and diversify our portfolios in order to sell as much U.S. soy as we possibly can. So USEC is certainly looking forward to being a partner in that with USDA, but we also are looking at certainly prioritizing a more diverse portfolio globally.
That's Kevin Ripke, Regional Director for the Americas with the U.S. Soybean Export Council, who joins us on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
And Gregg Eyestone there. Many thanks, Greg. We'll return in a few moments with more here on Agriculture Today. For 25 years, K-State Research and Extension's Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services has been providing a no-cost, confidential place to call in and visit with an agricultural lawyer. Our experts are available to help you producers handle legal and financial issues. Explore your options and generate solutions. Call us at 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. We're back now on this Agriculture Today, the weekly K-State horticulture segment coming your way now. The gardening season is wrapping up and the leaves are falling on our home lawns and around our landscape, so it's time to think cleanup for the season, and aligned with that, potentially starting a compost pile from that organic material that has accumulated in your gardens and landscapes the past year. Joining us once again, Riley County Extension Horticultural Agent Gregg Eyestone. Cleanup is important for a variety of reasons, but not just for the cosmetics. It does serve a purpose in both lawn and garden, does it not, Greg?
It's a natural process, and so those materials need to be used wisely and put back into the soil where they originated from at one point, and so it's important that we do utilize those materials. Sometimes we have an abundance and may need to take them off-site, take them to a local transfer station or composting area, but you can obviously use it on your own property. You can build a structure to put those materials together, or for a lot of leaves, tissue, you can just chop them up with a lawnmower and let them stay on the soil, whether it's in your lawn or vegetable garden or what have you.
Well, let's talk about home composting then and how to go about it. It's a biological process to create a compost pile that can be useful on down the line. Where does one start?
gathering up your materials, and that means typically some type of structure to keep them contained. That can be as simple as some wire, chicken wire. People oftentimes use wood pallets. Typically 4 to 5 foot kind of square or rectangle is going to make the composting process function more efficiently. And so that's kind of the size that we're looking at. And we use what we call brown tissues, the tree leaves drying up. Anything that's brown in color typically is our brown portion of that. And it does need some nitrogen, which is typically in your green materials. That's where if you're mowing the lawn, a little bit of leaf clippings, the green, and your brown tissues from the tree leaves are kind of a natural combination there that can be chopped up and utilized, whether you leave it on the lawn or if you want to bag or rake that up and put it into your composting process. It's going to take some time. The finer the materials are chopped up, the quicker that will break down. It's also based on temperatures and moisture content. And so in an ideal situation, you can make compost fairly quickly. Small materials, the right combinations of brown tissue, carbon to the nitrogen ratio, stirring that as that process takes place. I get some questions on some of these commercial tumblers or some type of container that can make compost, they say, in a few weeks. And that can be done. It just takes a little more effort on the composter to make sure that they got the right combinations and keep it moist and are stirring that up.
But the mixing is important as opposed to layering those materials by type, right?
Well, typically, you start out with some type of process. So you do make kind of a lasagna, kind of a mixture there of some browns and some greens and more browns and greens, because we're talking about 4 to 5 feet of materials square, and then you do need to blend that together as it proceeds because the outside edges are not going to be composting like the inner portions, and so you're going to have to mix that together. This does take microorganisms to run this process, so sometimes a little bit of old compost, manure, just some soil mixed in there is going to add those microorganisms. Now, I think many of us do my type of composting, which is we just throw all our stuff into a pile and let nature take its course. From my observation, that may be a 6-8 year process for that to break down, but I'd have no inputs as far as stirring and chopping those materials up. So there's different ways of doing it. The main thing, I think, is that you do utilize these materials back into your landscape because they are very useful. And if you don't use them and they get into our stormwater systems or other things, they do have nutrients. So that means you're wasting fertilizer and causing a problem, probably somewhere down the road.
Well, Gregg, if one wants to expedite the process and doesn't have green material loaded up with nitrogen, can a commercial fertilizer product substitute?
Yeah, so you can just use some of your lawn fertilizer, probably without the weed product, herbicide in it. Blood meal, those things have nitrogen. That's what runs the microorganisms to function at a high level.
Just a quick thought back to the container you're using, and you mentioned pallets or mesh wire, perhaps. Is ventilation important in the process then?
That's a very good point, yes. It can become anaerobic if it gets too wet and not enough air through there, and so then your compost pile stinks. And so if it is stinking, something that you can't bear, that means it's got too wet, not enough air flow through there. Basically what you have to do is add some more of your carbon materials and mix that up, stir it up with some type of shovel or pitchfork or something like that, and get that process back into a working state.
So those are the basic steps to composting. And why are we composting? Well, that organic material that results can be very useful and valuable in future gardening or landscaping.
Yeah, has nutrients, has moisture holding capacity, actually has some pore space for oxygen to get to the root system. So once you have your compost finished, if you would, generally they say finished compost is when you can't really see what the original materials were. But there's also a process there that then they're kind of more compacted and not providing as much pore space. So there's different levels of when to apply your compost depending on your needs. So if you're looking at just strictly a nitrogen or a fertilizer source, finished compost definitely fills that need. If you're looking for adding a little bit more air into their soil, which is always important, you may want to use it in a little bit of more of a raw state, and so that there's more particle size differences so that there are air pockets in your soil. That means it's going to continue to break down and may use some nitrogen for those microorganisms, so you may need to watch your growth of your plants when you're using compost and may need to supplement the nitrogen to compensate for that continued composting process. But so it's a different way of which way you're looking to utilize those products.
Well, it is a practical outlet for that excess material remaining from your landscapes once again, or from your vegetable gardening. If you have any questions about the compost process, why, you can look into the materials that K-State Research and Extension has put together through your local extension office, or go online to the K-State Horticulture website. As always, Gregg, thanks for the input.
Appreciate it, Eric.
He is Gregg Eyestone, Riley County Extension Horticultural Agent, with some of the standard procedures for successfully composting organic material here at the end of the growing season. And that is this week's K-State Horticulture segment, rounding out our Thursday edition. Thanks for tuning in. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.